So I'm sitting down to talk about chapters 6 to 8 of The Feminine Mystique. I have two previous videos. If you haven't seen those yet, you'll probably want to take a look at those before you watch this one. Chapter 6 is perhaps the least interesting of these three chapters that I read. It's called The Functional Freeze, The Feminine Protest, and Margaret Mead. Kind of in the same vein as Chapter 5, Friedan is taking aim at the social sciences, at sociology in particular. Instead of destroying the old prejudices, she says that the popularizing of the social sciences in the 40s and 50s reinforced those prejudices, gave new authorship to old ideas. She latches on to Margaret Mead in particular, suggesting that Mead had a lot of progressive ideas that would have fostered equality between men and women, but instead sociology, the social sciences, education in particular latched on to the sexual aspect, the sexual differences between men and women, which perpetuated those old ideas. So Friedan talks about the function of women. Women are assigned a role not in terms of their ability, but in terms of function, she says, what their function should be rather than what they are capable of. The function of what women should be is frozen in time, she says, in the name of protectiveness. Under the guise of sociology or marriage and family life or life adjustment, women are offered the advice that men and women have separate and complementary roles. When women engage in the same occupations as men, the relationship breaks down. Essentially, it's a way of preserving the social order. It's not practical, Friedan says, many believed, for women to join the workforce, since that would leave a lot of unpaid labor. She doesn't use the term unpaid labor at this point, but that would leave no one to do the unpaid labor at home. Social scientists focused on helping women to adjust to life, to adjust to the social order, to adjust to marriage and to having children, rather than focusing on what was best for the women. Friedan also picks up on something which she refers to as the infantilizing. Basically the idea that the more dependent a woman is on her parents in her upbringing as a young woman, the less likely she is to pursue interests outside of the home, to pursue things beyond her designated fate, I suppose, to pursue higher education, because she's unable to think for herself. She goes from being dependent on her parents to being dependent on her husband. And in the next couple of chapters, Friedan notes that the education system mirrored this. The education system prepared women not to be independent, but to be dependent. And one final note on chapter 6, Friedan really does not like Freud, and she suggests that Mead was influenced by Freud. On to chapter 7 here. So chapter 7 is titled The Sex-Directed Educators. So this is really about the education system. She notes that in the 1950s, although a lot of women were still going to college, 2/3 of them dropped out before getting their degree. And a large percentage of women who were attending college went with the sole purpose of finding a husband. Many women would end up dropping out of college to get married, and they would then go to work and support their husbands who were working their way through college. She spent some time in the writing of this book interacting with college women, as I mentioned in the previous video. She recounts a story of of a class on government, full of women, and most of the women were knitting. And the professor, to try to get their attention, says Western civilization is failing. They all dutifully write it down, go back to knitting. And that was, Frieden felt, the state of women's education in the 1950s. And it's not that women were not interested, she says. She proposes that women feigned disinterest on purpose. They ignored their education because they knew if they got too passionately involved with their education, they would desire something more. They would pursue something more that would make them discontent in their role as women, in their role as wives and mothers later on. She has some pretty damning words about education now. I imagine it wasn't like this everywhere, because it couldn't have been, but a lot of educators were of the mind that women didn't really need education anymore. They didn't need to have their minds cultivated, because it was about preparing women for their role as wives and mothers, rather than preparing their minds, preparing them to face the real world. Frieden recounts instances of guidance counselors discouraging women from pursuing certain career paths, stories of women in the sciences dropping out because they felt it made them unsuitable for marriage. It would make them unable to be married later on, or basically damn them to a life of chastity, because this was the 1950s. If you were not married, there's a good chance that you were not having sex because it wasn't socially acceptable. So you had a choice. You could fulfill yourself sexually by getting married, or you could live a chaste life, at least outwardly, and pursue your career. So she ends chapter 7 by suggesting that women felt they had a choice. They could pursue the feminine, or they could pursue a career which was felt to be masculine. Education essentially was seen as something which threatened a woman's femininity. And that brings us to chapter 8, which is called The Mistaken Choice. So Frieden tries to work out why women would make this choice, why they would choose marriage and the home life over education, why men themselves would choose this very domestic life. And at such a young age, too. So she takes us back to the Second World War and suggests that when the men were coming home, they desired their mothers. They desired the home life that they hadn't had. And so they, of course, got married. They had children, and they tried to rebuild that home life that they experienced before the war. On the part of the women, she says that it was often easier, with the men coming back to jobs, for them to not fight, for them to take the home life. A quote to be specific, she says, "It was easier to love and be loved than to compete with men." At the same time, women had taken in this idea of the feminine mystique, which I think explains a lot of it, because just the desire not to compete doesn't seem quite enough. And I'm sure there are other factors as well that Frieden missed. But then she goes on to discuss why women, once they got into this domestic role, into this sexualized role, why they were so eager to continue with it, to keep trying, to do what they thought was better than their mothers. It comes back to psychology again. Frieden suggests that a lot of the mental illnesses, alcoholism, maladjustment that men picked up during the war, a lot of that was seen as the mother's fault, their mother's fault. And a lot of sociologists, a lot of psychologists at the time proposed that it was because these men's mothers had been so independent, because they were modern independent women, the women of the 1920s and the 1930s, that these men were so ill-adjusted. Every little thing was blamed on parenting, on mothering. But Frieden says they got this wrong. It was actually over-mothering, she says, that caused this maladjustment later in life. And having more independent role models as mothers would have helped them be more adjusted. Her arguments are a little bit hard to follow in this chapter, but essentially what it comes down to is that women did go back to the home for a variety of reasons, and they shunned education because they felt it was unfeminine. And that is where she leaves us at the end of Chapter 8. By the way, I am drinking a blackberry cider that I picked up at the wine rack a couple hours ago after I finished these chapters, before I sat down to film this video. Yeah, chapter 6 to 8. I will see you soon with the next installment of The Feminine Mystique.